Hi everyone, in today's video we're going to do a full walkthrough and breakdown for AQA's GCSE English Language Paper 2. So just like Paper 1, Paper 2 is also 1 hour and 45 minutes and it's out of 80 marks. And also like Paper 1, this paper is made up of two sections, A and B. For Section A, you'll be questioned on two sources given. Generally for Paper 2, this is the non-fiction based paper, which means that the sources you'll be given might include things like articles or autobiographies instead of fictional stories. And this also means that for the creative writing, Section B, you'll be asked to write something of a non-fiction nature, so maybe that's a speech or a letter, and this will typically focus on a persuasive or argumentative style of writing. Now, just a quick overview before we get started. They recommend we spend 15 minutes reading the sources, 45 minutes on Section A, which is question 1 to 4, and 45 minutes on Section B, which is question 5. So for the sake of this video, we'll be using the 2022 paper as an example to guide us through each question. Now, I will link both sources A and B in the description, and of course we'll be using them in this video, so feel free to have them open as we go through each question. But just to quickly summarise, this paper focuses on two non-fiction extracts, as I said. So one is a modern article from The Guardian written by a journalist experiencing insomnia, and the second extract is a 19th century letter from Lucy Hutchinson writing about her own experience of a sleepless night. So we will be looking at each question in detail, covering how much to write, how long to spend, and example top grade answers for question 1 to 5. Okay, so let's jump straight into it. So as we've said, it's advised that we spend about 45 minutes on Section A. So, starting with question 1. This is super straightforward. You'll be given 8 statements and you simply tick the 4 that are true based on source A only. Now with this question, make sure that you read through all the statements properly and do not tick any statements which seem like an assumption. The second very important thing is to make sure that you are looking within the line interval. So here they've told us that they want us to look at lines 1 to 6 to find the 4 statements which are true. Okay, so let's do that. Also, really quickly, feel free to pause here and reference to the source linked below if you'd like to try to do this on your own. Now, these are the statements which I identified highlighted in green. In your exam, if it helps to underline these, then do so. You'll find that you'll need to cross-check between each statement and go back and forth between the statements and the extract to ensure that you have the correct answers. Okay, great. So now that we've identified them, we're going back to the question paper and ticking these off. So you should have B, D, F, and H. Spend about 3 to 5 minutes on this. Don't rush it. Again, with question 1, a lot of students miss out on these easy 4 marks because it's the rush of the exam. You've just sat down and opened your paper and this is the first question that you see. Just make sure to give this question the time, even if that means reading over a statement twice, because it's really not worth losing out on these easy marks due to nerves and the tension of being in exam conditions. And that's it for question 1, so now let's move on to question 2. Now this question will ask you to refer to both sources and summarise differences between them. Usually it's about a theme like the writer's attitudes, experiences, or the methods they use. In this paper, it's how the two writers deal with being awake at night. Now don't let the idea of them saying refer to both sources make you feel overwhelmed. My one tip would be to ensure that you've understood the key idea of each text when you read them at the beginning. So generally speaking for paper 2, this just means make a note that maybe one source sounds more positive than the other. Or perhaps source A might sound more informative and formal, whereas source B might sound more casual and personal. Acknowledging this early on will really help you in the long run for this paper. Okay, so how long are we spending on this question? So for question 2, you're looking to spend around 10 to 12 minutes max, writing 2 focused paragraphs with well-developed comparisons between source A and B. Now I've put 2 to 3 paragraphs because I know some people's paragraphs are smaller than others, but just as long as you have the main points down and you've summarised the comparison well, that's what's important. Now another thing that examiners really like for this question is when you use quotes as evidence from the text. So not too many, but even if it's just a few that highlight the differences between the two sources within the context of the question. This question can be quite tricky because we aren't necessarily taught how to write summaries, we're taught to analyse. However, in question 2, they don't want you to be zooming in and talking about the impact of alliteration or structural techniques like ellipsis or dashes or anything like that. They just want you to understand the key ideas of each text. And they want to know that you can spot the differences in things like the general tone and the approach of the narrator. Okay, so let's just take a quick look at a top grade example together. So feel free to pause and have a read. Also make sure to make a note of how the quotes have been embedded and also the type of comparative language being used. This just means using phrases like in contrast, whereas, or on the other hand. Saying these phrases in your response really gives the examiner the impression that you're efficiently summarizing a comparative response for both texts. Okay, great, so that's all done. Now let's move on to question 3. So question 3 is 12 marks, so this one just focuses on source B. So in our case, we're looking at the 19th century extract. And again, we're being asked to do our analysis between a certain number of lines, and in this case, it's lines 23 to 30. Again, make sure you're paying close attention to this in the exam to avoid missing out on any marks. It's really easy to overlook in the rush of the exam, but they will always give you a line interval, so just make sure that your response stays within this limit that they've set. Now, question 3 is great because we are probably used to approaching questions this way in terms of being asked to analyse language techniques. And you might notice that this is very similar to question 2 in Language Paper 1. The only key difference is that we are analysing a non-fiction text, so how do we do this? Well, it's incredibly similar to what you're used to analysing with everything else. You're looking to analyse language, so focus on things like adjectives, imagery, metaphors and similes, particular word or phrase choices, etc. You're aiming for 3 well-developed paragraphs, so each exploring a language feature, its effect, and ideally close analysis so that zooming in into a specific word if it has a particular impact on the reader. Make sure to spend about 15 minutes on this, and don't forget, again, this is only about source B, so do not compare. So here I've put the passage that they want us to look at, so that's lines 23 to 30. Pause and have a go at writing your own response, and we can look at an example response together. So now let's look at an example answer together. So again, have a pause to read and make any notes of anything that you might be missing in your paragraph, so whether that's the close analysis or discussing the impact of the reader. Notice how I've identified the language technique, clearly named it, and used a quote to exemplify how it's being used, and then I'm explaining the impact of the writer doing this. Okay, perfect. So now let's move on to the final question of section A, which is question 4. So question 4 is 16 marks and asks us to compare how each writer conveys their different feelings and perspectives on their experiences of sleep and sleeplessness in the whole of source A and the whole of source B. Now, this is the biggest question in section A, so make sure you give yourself enough time to answer it to the best of your ability. You want to spend around 20 minutes on this question and write 3 to 4 developed paragraphs. Now, the most common concern students have with question 4 is this sounds a lot like question 2. They're asking us to compare both sources, and it's not directly asking us how the writer uses language or structure, it's just telling us to discuss their feelings and perspectives. For this question, make sure that you use the bullet points as a guide. So remember, these are not just prompts to help us, but also hint at what the examiner will be looking for in your writing. So what does this mean, feelings and perspectives? Well, we want to look for what methods the writers use. So yes, this does include identifying language and structural techniques and their impact on the reader. However, don't forget to also talk about the tone and the expression of the narrator throughout each source. A tip for this question is to make sure you say the phrase the writer's intention in using, and then continue with identifying that language or structural technique and explaining the impact it has on the reader. Including this phrase in and throughout your response once or a couple of times reminds the examiner that you're linking back to the question because it echoes the wording of the question, and also it just means you don't have to keep repeating the words the impact this leaves on the reader is, etc. My last key thing about this question, which differentiates it from all the other questions, is going into detail about the impression the writer leaves and what we understand from their experience. Don't just list out language and structural techniques, make sure you are really honing in on what this tells the reader about the writer's experience. So for example, this might mean how the writer is expressing their emotions and how this might make the reader feel. Let's look at an example response together. So make sure to make a note of the use of embedded quotes to make your writing come across more advanced, and also make a note of the comparative language used to tell the examiner, yes, I read the question and I'm writing in a comparative style discussing each writer's feelings and perspectives. Okay, great, so just a quick recap of section A before we move on to the last question in section B. So question 1, we're looking for 4 true statements. We don't want to overthink this question, but also we don't want to rush through it. Question 2, we're comparing differences in the writer's experience and we're writing in a summary style, so there's no need for any close analysis. For question 3, we are doing a close analysis and we're keeping a particular eye out for language techniques which we want to zoom in on for the source that they've asked us to look at. And finally, for question 4, we're comparing views and methods, focusing on tone, language and structure to discuss the writer's feelings and perspectives. And for section A, particularly question 2, 3, and 4, make sure that you're backing up your points using evidence from the text, so use quotes where you can. Okay, so now let's look at section B. So question 5 is worth half the paper, and they recommend that we spend 45 minutes on this, so at this point you should be halfway through your time in the exam. So we're almost there, we're halfway done. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, this will be where you're asked to write to argue, persuade, or explain. Usually they give you a short statement to respond to. In this case, they have said, scientists say that teenagers are not like adults. They learn and socialize differently and need to sleep at different times. So you want to write a letter to the Minister of Education explaining your point of view on this statement. Okay, so now that we know what the task is, we want to spend 5 to 10 minutes planning, 30 minutes writing, and try to leave an extra 5 minutes at the end to check over your work. Now, in terms of persuasive techniques to use, you want to be using language and structural techniques generally, so whether that's personification, metaphors, similes, and the rest. However, my one tip would be to ensure that you have these 4 key techniques, if you don't already, in your writing to really make it stand out as a persuasive piece. So the first 2 we have are direct address and rhetorical questions. So you can often pair these together and it works really effectively. An example might be in an opening statement, you could say something like, "Do you really believe students are currently as productive as they can be?" These are great to engage your reader and also remind the examiner that you know you're writing to a particular audience. Now, the next key technique that you can include in your writing is the use of facts and statistics. Now, when using these, just make sure that they're in favour of your argument. So let's take another example. Let's say if we're being asked to write about if we think holidays abroad are really worth all the money. And let's say that in your argument, you've decided to say, no, holidays abroad are not worth spending all that money. You could use a statistic like 80% of people travelling regret spending that much and wish they travelled more locally and put that money to better use. This way, you've used the stat which doesn't contradict your argument but strengthens it instead. Now, the last technique I'd really advise you use is a personal quote or anecdote. So this can be something really short, nothing too long, no personal accounts that take away from the core focus of your writing. But let's again use this holiday example. For the personal anecdote or quote, you could have something like, "We conducted a survey," or "Our magazine conducted a survey, and one air hostess claimed, most travellers on their flight back from holiday destinations seem miserable and grumpy as they've come back feeling they've wasted their money." Now, these techniques are small things which you can add into your writing, but again, they make all the difference and work very effectively for question 5. And of course, this is among your other language and structural techniques, so please don't forget to use them too. Now, I'm not going to make you sit and watch me write a letter to the Minister of Education. However, we can go through an example structure which hopefully will help you in the exam. So first, the introduction, which can also function as your hook. Make sure you have a strong opening and ensure you clearly state your view, so decide early on if you agree or disagree with the statement. Now, be really careful, don't say "I agree" or "I disagree" because you are writing in a format where you wouldn't usually do that. So for example, you'd never start off a letter by saying "I agree" or "I disagree." Therefore, just make sure to capture the idea of the statement you've been given in your introduction. An example of this for our question 5 in this paper might be something like, "Every night, thousands of people reach for sleeping pills to find rest. But are we too quick to medicate a problem which often needs a lifestyle change, not a prescription?" This way, you've clearly hinted at your views on this statement, whilst also incorporating a rhetorical question. Okay, so after this, you want to move on to the first main point of your argument or persuasive discussion. You want to make sure this first point is very strong and uses persuasive techniques and relevant examples. Of course, make sure you do this throughout the whole of your writing for question 5. When you get to writing your second point, offer a counter-argument and then refute it. This shows balance and will advance your persuasive writing. So here, let's say you frame your argument and say that you think, yes, the day should be restructured so that students have more time to sleep. Your counter-argument might sound something like this. Some may argue or believe starting school later would make the day less productive and clash with parents' work schedules. However, when refuting this and reinstating your point, you might say something like, "Even though that's somewhat true, studies actually show that well-rested students perform better academically, so the long-term benefits outweigh temporary routine changes." So that's now made your argument stronger. Just make sure that the counter-argument you present is something that you can argue against. Now for point 3, link it back to real life or wider context and make sure that you're still very strong and confident in your tone. It's very important to maintain this, especially after presenting a counter-argument. Now remember, just because we've said 3 points, it doesn't mean that it's just 3 paragraphs. If you choose to spread a point over 2 paragraphs to develop it more, that's completely fine. Just make sure that you're keeping an eye on the clock in the exam and giving yourself enough time to finish this question. Now lastly, the conclusion, which should strongly summarize your point of view with impact to close off your argument. Finally, just some really quick do's and don'ts for question 5. So let's look at the do's first. First thing to do is make sure you have a clear structure. So this is introduction, 2 to 3 main points, and your strong conclusion. Also make sure that you do use persuasive devices, so that's rhetorical questions, facts, repetition, emotive language, etc. Also make sure you have a strong, confident tone throughout your writing. And use structural techniques effectively, for example, varying sentence types and punctuation. And lastly, just make sure that you have really clear paragraphs. So now on to things that you definitely don't want to be doing for question 5. So first, avoid repeating the same points in your argument. Now this can be prevented in your planning stage, so just make sure that you are spending enough time making strong but varied points. Also, don't use abbreviations or slang, so unless it's for effect, it's usually quite good to keep it formal. But again, like I said, just think about your audience. For example, in this paper, we were writing a letter to the Minister of Education, so we want to keep it formal. Now, this actually brings us on quite nicely to our last point, which is do not ignore the format. And also make sure that you stick with this throughout your writing, so don't start off by writing a letter or an article and then lose sight of that by the end. Ensure that you're being consistent because examiners will always pick up on any areas where you start to lose focus of your audience or the style of writing. So that's everything you need to know for Paper 2 of AQA English Language. Make sure to also drop your own tips or questions in the comments, and if you found this helpful, please don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Now, as always, thanks so much for watching, good luck with your revision, and I'll see you in the next video.